Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bill Lacey. I'm the director of the Dole Institute of Politics. We're delighted that you could join us today for this very exciting program. It's what I would describe as a threefer. Not only do you get to hear the Doles in the 76th presidential election with our 2016 Dole Archives Fellow, you also get to see the opening of our exciting new exhibit on the 76th presidential campaign and Bob and Elizabeth Dole's role in that. And you also get to be part of the kickoff of our fall programming. One announcement before we get started: a number of you have taken advantage of bringing some refreshments in. That's perfectly all right, but if you would, take your trash out and throw it away when you leave. Don't leave it for our staff to pick up. We would appreciate that. 1976 was an extraordinary campaign. When students or anyone comes to me and says, if you could look at a historical campaign that you could learn a lot from, which would you select? Now, of course, I've got personal ties to 80 and 84 and 88. The 2008-2012 campaigns were historical in many respects. 2016 looks like it's going to be historical in many respects. But somebody said cataclysmic. I guess that depends upon your perspective. When I look for an election that has a presidential election that has enormous fascination, it's back 40 years ago to 1976. You had an incumbent president challenged and almost losing his own party's nomination. You had the last contested major party convention in our country. You had an outsider, governor from Georgia, nominated to be the nominee for the Democrats. You had a launching pad for Governor Reagan, soon to be President Reagan in 4 years. You had a national spotlight placed on Bob and Elizabeth Dole, and that spotlight has essentially continued now for 40 years, which is a remarkable story. And they are the quintessential power couple, probably along with the Clintons. And it's a very important story, and you're going to hear a lot about that today. And then the final thing that I find fascinating about 1976 is that President Carter and then Senator Mondale started after the Democratic Convention with a 30-point lead, and that lead evaporated and the election wound up in a dead heat. So it was a fascinating 1976 election, and you're going to hear about it, especially the Dole's role in that today. Our team here at the Dole Institute, I've said this very often, I'm very proud of the team that we have. They do a fantastic job. I'm particularly proud of our archival team. Our senior archivist and assistant director conceived this exhibit, came up with the idea, recruited our archival fellow, and then went and actually helped us obtain the funding to do this in a program in conjunction with the Kansas City Library. She provides great leadership for our archival team, is a delight to work with, does a fantastic job. Please welcome our senior archivist and assistant director, Audrey Coleman. Audrey?
Thanks for the introduction, Bill, and thank you all for taking the time to be with us this afternoon on what is an absolutely gorgeous day. Who would have figured? You had a little time to peek at our new exhibit, and we're excited to follow that with a really engaging program. First, let me tell you a little bit about the why, where, and who of today's events, which are installments of the ongoing Legacies of 76 project produced by the Dole Institute and funded by the Enid and Crosby Kemper Foundation. We started with a fascinating subject, the 1976 presidential campaign, a subject largely untapped by scholars, and a historical collection, our Dole Archives, which documents extensively the strategy of the Republican ticket that year. Our exhibit, From State to Nation, Dole for Vice President 1976, opens today and will be open through January 13th, 2017. It traces the chronology of the 1976 campaign, primaries through Election Day, highlighting the Dole campaign strategy, which exercised Bob Dole's strengths in statewide retail politics writ large, as well as the enduring legacies of that race in each Dole's, both Bob and Elizabeth's career. Other events in the Legacies of 76 project have and will take us beyond the walls of the Dole Institute to two places where the 76 campaign created milestone memories for local communities. We found inspiration in the story of the Republican National Convention at Kemper Arena in Kansas City, Missouri, where Bob Dole was nominated for vice president, as well as his subsequent Ford-Dole visit to Bob Dole's hometown in Russell, Kansas. You can still visit the exhibit, Republican Showdown in Kansas City, at the Kansas City Public Library, and that's on display through August 28th at their Central Branch. Next week, on Saturday, August 20th, in a community event held by the Russell County Historical Society, you can trade stories of the historic Ford-Dole presidential visit to Russell on the Russell County Courthouse lawn beginning at 10 o'clock. Aldine Banker, Kay Homewood, and a host of folks out there in Russell have been doing a lot of work. There's a wonderful exhibit at the Fossil Station Historical Museum there, and I encourage you, if you want to keep following the story and eager to share your memories, that you join us next Saturday at 10 o'clock out there in Russell. For details, you can read more at russellkansashistory.com. That's russellkshistory.com. But these two events, 40 years ago, were just the beginning of a transformative campaign for not one, but two Doles. And to those of you who, after seeing our exhibit and program today, are interested in learning still more on your own, connect to hundreds of searchable archival photos, documents, and audio recordings on our Legacies of 76 online portal. And you can find that at doleinstitute.org. And stay tuned for more features that we may have up our sleeve. We just can't get enough of 1976. I hope you've enjoyed what you've seen of the exhibit thus far. It's a showcase for our collections and a reminder that the legacy of decades-long leadership is built on wins, losses, and a whole lot of day-to-day. There are many more moving parts of the projects like these, and a lot of people to credit for what you see today. As Bill mentioned, we've got an amazing team at the Dole Institute, and not a single person has not been a part of some kind of preparations, be it today's events or the exhibit itself. I'm grateful to each member of that team for your time and talent, from marking up exhibit drafts, working through event logistics, marketing, and more. It's been truly thrilling to see all this come together in these final weeks. Without the work of staff archivists Sarah D'Antonio and Aaron Wolf and the students they supervise, there would be no projects, plain and simple. The volume of material would have been impossible to navigate. There would be nothing on the walls and no resources online. Our public educator, Julie Burgundy, wrangled unruly museum guests, adults and children, with aplomb, while we had our noses in boxes and our eyes squinting over thousands of digital images online. Volunteers have been the icing on the cake for 2 years running. Barb Watkins offered her services as our dedicated proofreader, and Jen Nigro and Doug Washburn with the Kansas Audio Reader Network donated their award-winning talent to us again this year to create audio description for our exhibit. And Senators Bob and Elizabeth Dole embraced our efforts, sharing their memories with us of their lives of service and leading us to the remarkable stories you'll hear today. Thank you, Senator Bob and Senator Elizabeth, and I think you might be out there watching over the live stream. Greetings from Kansas, and we hope you're well. Last but not least, presidential historian Bob Greene, our 2016 Dole Archives Curatorial Research Fellow, you'll hear from him in just a minute, I'm not quite done, contributed his scholarly expertise and expansive historical perspective spanning the Eisenhower, Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and Bush administrations to help us contextualize our collection materials and stitch together a cohesive exhibit narrative that hovers around not 2,500 pages, but 2,500 words. And that is no easy feat. So without further delay, allow me to tell you a little bit more about Dr. Greene. Dr. Greene is a presidential historian and the Paul J. Schupf Professor of History and Humanities and the college archivist at Cazenovia College in Cazenovia, New York. He has published over 100 articles and reviews and served as a commentator and script advisor to several PBS documentaries, including American Experience, George W. Bush in 2008. Dr. Greene has written or edited 17 books on American politics and the presidency and published extensively with the University Press of Kansas. His book, I Like Ike, The Presidential Election of 1952, is currently in press. Bob has been a joy to get to know over the last few months, and we've had a great fun this week here on site with him at the Dole Archives. Following his presentation, we'll have Q&A, and we'll have students arrive with microphones to take your questions. And when your turn arises, please raise your hand and ask just one brief question. It's now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Dr. Bob Greene.
Thank you. it has been a blast being here this past week. And it's very good of you all to come out on such a gorgeous Sunday, taking your time away from mowing the lawn, which we don't have up north now. It's been such a bad drought. And hopefully we'll have some things to share about Bob and Elizabeth Dole that will interest all of us, but I'm really looking forward to the Q&A, which is probably going to lean towards the A part of it from you as you teach me more than I know. I am from upstate New York, about 20 miles from Syracuse, a small liberal arts college. Cazenovia College has been around since 1824. That's what it looks like now, but as I've endured 90-degree heat here, and I was in Texas the week before, I know that by October, it's going to look like this. You need to know, if you don't know this already, that you have here at the Dole Institute a staff and a physical plant that approximates the presidential library system. And I have used all the presidential library system, presidential libraries save two. What they have here, their abilities, their skills, but most importantly, their sense of humor and their willingness to help has just made this past week enjoyable. If you haven't seen it already, these are pictures, and Audrey kind of photobombed one of them. You can see her over in her office on the far right-hand corner of that bottom picture. That's the reading room right across the hall here where I worked for the past week. I too want to thank Sarah, and I want to thank Aaron, and I want to thank Kylie, and I want to thank, where's Lawrence? Lawrence is around someplace. But most importantly, Audrey, who has made me feel at home here and is just an absolutely superb archivist. Bill, you got a first-class place here. There's no doubt about it. But I do tend, one of the great things about traveling and being a scholar is getting a chance to meet people out on the road and make brand new friends. For any friends at Syracuse, we have this little animated baseball mitt, Otto the Orange, who is our mascot. I just wanted you to know that I posed with a real one. This opening story gives away a lot of the presentation, but whatever. When I was originally asked by Audrey to be a part of this, the next step is a formal application process. And Audrey asked me for a title. Now, there's a dirty little secret about scholars given titles for these things. We make them up. I didn't know what I was doing. So I made up this title, Bob Dole in the Vice Presidential Campaign of 1976, back in February. Now, the job of the professional historian is not just to regurgitate facts. It's not to show you all the important people that they know. It's not to parade things in front of you, but it's to take all those people, it's to take all those facts and come up with a working hypothesis. What does it all mean? My knowledge of 1976 and 4 books that I've written, mixed with your knowledge, is just factual information. You want to know what I think about all this. And it didn't take long for me to change this title. My working title was Bob Dole in the Vice Presidential Campaign, but as you know from the literature, you know from the program that was given to you, and now I want to highlight it. This was one of the major things that came out of 8 months of research. It was the Doles campaign. A full partnership, more so than the Fords, the Carters, or the Mondales. I found that Elizabeth Dole was the first spouse of a vice presidential candidate to be used as an independent campaigner. I'm going to talk more about that and let Elizabeth Dole in a moment tell you a little bit about that. The first since Eleanor Roosevelt. And I stumbled on it when I was interviewing Elizabeth Dole, and then when I got to the archives and got the records out, it was absolutely clear. This is a unique political story that has not, even with the Clintons, has not been duplicated since. So let's get a little bit of some relevant background here. I don't want to start out with a Wikipedia biography of the Doles. You all know it, and it's the purview of a biographer. But I do want to talk about a little bit of background that I think is relevant with Bob Dole and with Elizabeth Dole that ties in with the 1976 election. With Bob Dole, we talk about his political style, what the press thought his political style was, what his political style really was, and an explanation for it. While he was in the House of Representatives from 1961 to 1969, Dole was a conservative who said little and attracted very little attention. That changed when he went to the Senate in 1968. Dole found a vacuum in the Senate in 1968 that did not exist when he was a member of the House under Eisenhower. Being in the minority, there were few Republicans who would stand up on the floor of the Senate, because there was very few of them, and defend Richard Nixon. There was a vacuum for supporters of the administration, and Dole stepped into that vacuum with gusto. He vocally defended the ABM Treaty, the Hainsworth and Carswell nominations, the SST, Vietnam, Cambodia, to the point where he was often the only senator who would speak up in the pre-C-SPAN days on the floor of the Senate. This angered the Senate leadership, his own leadership, who still felt that in that day that freshmen should be seen and not heard. Out of that comes the belief that Dole was being used by the administration as an attack dog. There are letters from Bob Haldeman to Richard Nixon in Nixon's papers, Haldeman's diaries, that show that they tried to do that, but they never really got complete control of him. Now, what I want to say about this before we turn to Elizabeth Dole is that there is a big difference between a person who is naturally an attack dog type person and a person who uses it as a strategy. Dole used it as a strategy. The White House wanted him to attack when he felt that he could and felt that he should. He did. And he made that a part of his repertoire at the Republican National Committee as well. Now, Dole never felt that his loyalty was returned by the White House. He would, and at least said he would have, voted to convict Richard Nixon had it gotten to the Senate in 1974. But this is a strategy, not the type of person that Bob Dole, I mean, you just have to ask anybody in Kansas. I mean, Bill Brock, who was a colleague of his for years, said, and I quote, "The Bob Dole that served the people of Kansas in the Congress and in the Senate was never a mean-spirited, bitter person." And yet, when Gerald Ford chooses him, as we're going to see, he wants the attack dog. He asks for the attack dog, and he expects it. That's going to be a part of the campaign. (1958) BA from Duke, 1959 post-grad work, 1959 student teacher in Massachusetts, MA from Harvard, JD from Harvard, Deputy Assistant to the President for Consumer Affairs. Do you really think that she's going to just simply bake cookies in 1976? The role that Elizabeth Dole plays in this campaign comes out of this background, and particularly out of her background at the Federal Trade Commission. She is the first presidential spouse, the first presidential or vice presidential spouse in a campaign to be a member of the federal government. She was sworn in from her hospital bed, December 4th of 1973, to a 7-year term on the FTC appointed by President Nixon. So she was a part of the administration, part of the federal government, and yet she was the spouse of the soon-to-be vice presidential candidate. How do you deal with that? It had never been done before. They did not prepare for it because Dole didn't prepare for his choice as vice president. As we're going to see, this happens literally on the floor of the Kemper Arena when the list goes from 7 to 4 to 1. But there was no amount of preparation that could get Elizabeth Dole ready, and she had the White House lawyers scurrying to try and figure out whether she could even keep her job. It was all uncharted territory. So the two things that I think of the many, many things that we should look at in terms of the personalities and backgrounds of these two remarkable individuals are the expectation of Bob Dole to go on the attack and Elizabeth Dole's, shall we, ambivalent situation with the Federal Trade Commission. Let's do a quick setup on 1976. This is not an audience that I need to remind about 1976, but I have the podium and the microphone and I can get away with it. Everything was seen in light of Watergate. Flowing from the resignation of Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford essentially had what I called in my book the 30-day first term, which ends exactly 30 days after his inauguration with his granting Nixon a full pardon. Dole would say later that if he had been doing it, he would have waited for Nixon to have been indicted. Dole has never said that he wouldn't have pardoned Nixon, but he would have waited for Nixon to have been indicted, which Ford did not do. Add to that the festering economy. Those of us in New York remember this headline. It was the decision of President Ford not to add federal, and Secretary of the Treasury Bill Simon, not to add to the bailout of New York City, and it was essentially telling New York City that they were on their own. You looked at this, and you just figured with these things, Ford didn't have a chance in hell. Add to that a person who figured that this was his chance. Bill was saying a moment ago that one of the remarkable things about this election was that Ronald Reagan, operating on a shoestring and with a staff that was literally learning as they went from, I think, a year or so. He had been out of governorship for a year or so in 1976. Learning on the road, changing their strategy from state to state, and yet coming remarkably close to upsetting an incumbent president in Gerald Ford because of the dissatisfaction with the Ford administration. Ford himself tried to change things about 9 months before the election cycle started by doing what a lot of people thought was impossible, telling Nelson Rockefeller that he didn't have a job. Nelson Rockefeller, the vice president who had only been appointed and confirmed by the Senate less than a year before, was told by Ford, Rockefeller did not jump ship. Ford pushed him. There's no question about that. He wanted to make sure that there was something. First of all, Ford wanted to have a gap. He wanted to have something to put a card in the hole when he went to the Kemper Arena. He wanted to be able to name his vice presidential candidate depending on what happened with Reagan. And the second thing was Rockefeller was the liberals. Back in the day when there were Republican moderates, there may very well be, but they're in Kansas. We don't see them in New York. There's no question about that. Rockefeller was seen to be a liability. The basic fundamental strategy of Jimmy Carter was to corner the market on morality and beat Ford over the head with it. I will never lie to you. Ford knew that he was in a corner, but it took Ronald Reagan to get him out of it with an astoundingly stupid decision. Ronald Reagan chooses an ultra-liberal senator from Pennsylvania, Richard Schweiker, as his running mate 2 full weeks before the convention. When Schweiker was chosen, Bob Dole said that and I quote him, the choice in a letter to a Kansas constituent that's here in the archives, Dole quipped that Reagan's choice of Schweiker, quote, could very well injure his race for the Republican nomination. It destroyed it. Republican conservatives started peeling away from the Reagan campaign, and they were in play at the Kemper Arena. Ford told me in an interview a number of years ago that he went in with one set of figures to the Kemper Arena, got off the plane, and it was a brand new set of figures because so many were leaving because of the Schweiker defection. And remember, Ford now doesn't have a vice presidential candidate. So is he going to pick somebody who appeals to the conservatives who are peeling away because of Schweiker? Is he going to roll the dice? Is he going to choose a moderate like Schweiker? Or is he going to choose, as he almost did, the first woman to run on a presidential ticket? We know that Dole got it. How? We know that Bob Dole was chosen in 1976. How did he get it? Throughout the convention, Dole's name was continually on the short list that Ford and his advisors were considering. Now remember, Reagan is now, he has no short list. He's got Schweiker. And the reasons were weighty. Dole's willingness to be combative. One of his biographers said, and I quote, "What Ford wanted was a running mate who would bleed Carter with 1,000 cuts." So there was that. There was also the fact that Dole was from the heartland that was still beyond furious with Ford because of the grain embargo of 1976. For Ford to win anything between the Rockies and the Mississippi, a lot of people argued that a Midwestern candidate would have to be chosen. Now, these reasons carried weight. It's all in the literature, but ultimately I found three things were more important that led to Dole's choice. The first was that Ford owed Dole. The second was that Dole wanted it. And the third and the most surprising to me was that Ford was faced with a Hobson's choice literally hours before he chose Bob Dole that really tipped the scale in Dole's favor. Let's look at each one of these 3 points. Ford had known Bob Dole since Dole had been elected to Congress. Dole had thrown his support to Gerald Ford very, very early in the 1960s. The key here was that Dole had supported Ford in a long shot, which was Ford's run for minority leader in 1964 and 1965. Ford was elected minority leader over Charlie Halleck by a vote of 73 to 67. That's a virtual dead heat. And he clearly gave much of the credit for that victory to Bob Dole. 3 days before Christmas in 1964, Dole invited Ford to come and speak to the Kansas congressional delegation and campaign. And Ford told his biographer in the end that Dole persuaded those 3 other Kansas Republicans to vote with him. And those 4 votes, according to Ford, quoting him, saved the day. Without that minority position, without that minority leader position, Gerald Ford doesn't go anywhere. There's no Gerald Ford superstar. Not at all. This is how Senator Dole explained that moment to me.
I've known President Ford for how many years? In fact, 3 Kansas members of Congress in the House made him the Republican leader in his election, Ford versus Charlie Halleck.
64.
And we all liked Halleck. He had a problem, drinking problem. And we believe that despite our love and friendship for Charlie Halleck, we needed a new leader. A very tight race. I believe actually 4 Kansas votes made a difference, and I think it may have been a factor in Ford choosing me as his running mate. I think he remembered.
Ford's papers were clear. He did remember it, and he believed that he owed Bob Dole. The second point that I bring up is that Dole wanted it. There's no question about it because Dole himself says so. I found when I came here that Dole had been an active member of the President Ford Advisory Committee. He was an announced Ford delegate. And yet, despite that fact, Bob Dole would not criticize Ronald Reagan. Dole made it clear in several letters to his constituents that Sarah found for me that he supported Ford. He argued consistently that Ford was conservative enough for Reagan's supporters. I'm quoting him here. "It's my opinion that President Ford is a fairly conservative president. I do not consider it a breach of faith for a conservative to be a supporter of President Ford." Those are not the words of a person who's taking himself out of the running. In his book, their book, Unlimited Partners, Dole admits to this. He says that when he got to Kansas City, he asked Mel Laird, upper left corner with President Ford, Mel Laird to float his name in the press as a running mate. I didn't know whether that actually happened until I got here and found Dole's clipping files. And in the Topeka Capitol on August 19th, Laird claims that Dole remained, quote, under active consideration. So Laird played his part. But he also talked to somebody else, a close friend. This will test you. Who's with Ronald Reagan? You probably know him better with a goatee. You know, don't you, Bill? Who is it? Lynn Nofziger. That's Lynn Nofziger in a 1970 photo, who was also a close friend of Bob Dole. And Dole also, by his own admission, asked Lynn Nofziger to ask Reagan if he lost, and if Ford asked him about the vice presidency, if Reagan would say something nice if Dole's name came up. Dole definitely wanted it. There's no question about it. Part of that may have been Dole's choice as temporary chair. His loyalty to Ford and his being on the short list may have led to that. And just because I like stuff. This is in Kansas City now, isn't it? And that's in that display. Okay, this is the gavel that Bob Dole used as temporary chair of the convention. And an interesting note, and I want you to put this in the back of your mind now because this is a very well-educated audience. We know we have to deal with the Democratic wars comment here. We know what's going to happen in the vice presidential debate. Listen to Dole's speech of welcome from the convention on August 16th, and I quote, he's going down the litany that you get in these types of things. Are you for this? And everybody yells no. Are you for this? And everybody yells no. And he says, after all, was it a Republican administration that embroiled this wonderful country of ours in a devastating war in 1961? And everybody yells no. It was there at the convention, even before the debate, while he was pounding that gavel. And I believe that Mrs. Dole told me that when he was pounding that gavel, he pounded it so hard that he burst a blood vessel in his eye. Now, as important as all these factors was the fact that Dole's choice was ultimately a defensive move. And here we introduce the story of Gerald Ford's decision-making process. After his victory, Ford met with Reagan at his suite at the Alameda Plaza Hotel. They spoke about the vice presidency. Ford had a list, a written list that he laid in front of Reagan. And Ford in his memoirs remembered that it had 6 names on it. John Connally, the former Democratic governor of Texas, who had switched parties, served as Secretary of Treasury under Nixon. Elliot Richardson, member of Nixon's cabinet who had resigned as Attorney General rather than fire the special prosecutor under Richard Nixon's order. Under Gerald Ford, he'd served as ambassador to the UK and Secretary of Commerce. Elliot Ruckelshaus, who also refused to fire the special prosecutor, and in 1976 was serving as a D.C. lawyer. Howard Baker, Tennessee senator, who was best known to the American public at the time for his famous question, what did the president know and when did he know it? and Bill Simon, who was Ford's Secretary of the Treasury, along with Bob Dole. Those were the names put in front of Ronald Reagan. According to several people who were in the room, Ford, and I'm going to quote Ford, quoting, "Dole," Reagan replied, "would be an excellent choice." Reagan did not comment on any of the other names. Now this helps to clarify his thinking a little bit, because in the time that it took, about an hour and a half, to get from the Alameda Plaza to the Crown Center Hotel, apparently the real debate on the vice presidency started taking place in the car. At Ford's suite, this list of four went down to, in a, of course, reference here in basketball country, to the Final Four. Several things are interesting here. First of all, there's a new name on the list, Anne Armstrong. Armstrong at the time was serving as the ambassador to the United Kingdom. She was Republican politics in Texas and had been on several short lists for cabinet positions as they popped up through the Ford administration. Ford had not even bothered floating her name to Ronald Reagan, hadn't even mentioned it, and yet she's on the Final Four here. Even more interesting is that in the car, Simon, Richardson, and Connolly don't make the cut. So you can draw the conclusion that they were there simply to either push Dole to the top or to satisfy Ronald Reagan. Now, all four of these people had strengths and weaknesses. Each one of them had influential support from Ford insiders. Dole was found in polling material that I found at the Ford Library to hurt Ford the least among voters. And he was also seen to be the most acceptable to the Reaganites. They argued until about 5 a.m., and the president told everybody to go and get some sleep. They reconvened at 9 a.m., where Ford announced it's Dole. What ultimately tipped the scales for Dole against these three strong contenders? Well, there was the belief that he could be a strong campaigner, where Jerry Ford was, as we will see, the nice guy. There was the belief that Dole could help swing 4, maybe 5 Midwestern states against the grain embargo. But there was something else. Documents that were found by me at the Ford Library and were in my book on Gerald Ford, which, by the way, is published by the University Press of Kansas, makes for great Labor Day giving, can be purchased at several bookstores in the area. In the intervening hours, after they went to bed, Ford got a phone call. A movement had cropped up in southern states, particularly in the Mississippi delegation, under the iron control of Clark Reed. Reed told Ford point blank that Reagan was going to be nominated on the floor of the convention no matter what he did. There was only one way out. Reed said he might be able to stop it if Bob Dole was the candidate. This is in an oral history from Nelson Rockefeller, and its circumstances confirmed by a set of handwritten notes from Ron Nesson, Ford's press secretary, dated that night, quote, "Ford leaning to Ruckelshaus as late as 5 a.m. As a result of calls from Clark, Ford turns to Dole." Now, Ford doesn't help a bit in this to figure out whether this is all true. At one point in his memoirs, he said, "If I had been forced to disclose my nominees several weeks before the presidential balloting, Ruckelshaus might have been my choice." Later in his memoirs, he says, "In retrospect, if given the opportunity to make that decision again, I might as well have said, 'Damn the torpedoes,' and gambled on Anne." So Ford's not helping. In Unlimited Partners, nothing is said about Clark Reed's role by Bob Dole. So we have this hanging out there, but we know how it turned out. And by the way, the Russell newspaper is clear who they're really interested in here, right? Gerald Ford, he's kind of around on the edges. You know, Bob Dole, our Bob Dole is chosen. The Russell Daily News, by the way, was a very, very big help throughout the campaign, the clippings that were here. Elizabeth remembered that on the morning of August 19th, they heard a noise outside their hotel room. They thought that it was the Connollys who were next door. It turned out to be reporters. Bob Clark of ABC News called and said to Dole, "Bob, you're it. President Ford selected you." There was only one problem. Ford hadn't called Dole yet. Dole does remember the phone call from Ford, and he remembers Ford giving him a warning. Quote, "Just be careful what you say." He got the nod on August 19th, which would have been his father's 79th birthday. The acceptance speech was unique in a couple of ways, and acceptance speeches usually are what we have seen over the past summer, and please don't get me going when we start Q&A, because I'll go and go and go, and we'll never get out of here. They're usually dull, platitudinous, with lists of policies and everything, but Dole changed the game a little bit. For starters, he was nominated by Nelson Rockefeller, who had been booted. But can you imagine? Nelson Rockefeller, for starters, Nelson Rockefeller playing second fiddle to somebody and having to nominate him. He was seconded by Peggy, is it Pinder? Peggy Pinder, a 23-year-old law student from Iowa and an advocate for the National Federation for the Blind. She's reading her seconding speech for Bob Dole in Braille. There, Aaron helped me a lot with getting these photos together. That's a remarkable photograph right there. And Dole demanded that his speech be translated for the deaf. There was recently, I believe, a display here about Bob Dole and the disability advocacy. This shows it right from the start. In fact, that's the first time that the Republican National Convention had been translated for the deaf. The importance of Bob Dole to Russell, Kansas. Now and then. Elizabeth Dole remembered for me that the idea for the stop in Russell was Bob Dole's. Ford remembered in his memoirs that there was nobody on his staff who was in favor of it, for logistical reasons, which meant they didn't want to go to Kansas. Ford vetoed them all, grabbing Stu Spencer by the arm and said, "If I may, God damn it, I know what I'm doing. I know a little bit about politics." This makes clear the importance of the Midwest. I'm quoting Elizabeth Dole now in Unlimited Partners. "It was a symbolic way of reassuring farmers that the president meant what he said when he promised no future grain embargoes." That's all well and good, but that's not where Russell ended up. Elizabeth Dole said to me that it was one of the most emotional highlights of her life. Stock tanks were brought in to ice down the sodas. A bakery in Hutchinson went on a special shift to cook buns for 20,000 hot dogs. The Dream Theater hosted on its marquee, "Welcome President Ford and Bob." Ford and Dole went to the courthouse where Dole had served as county attorney, and he immediately became overwhelmed by emotion. This is Elizabeth Dole talking about that moment. Oops. Perhaps.
And of course, as you know, there was a moment when Bob teared up.
Yes.
He was looking out at the crowd. They were right there on the courthouse lawn where he had been county attorney. And he looked at these thousands of people. And I think when he and I discussed it later, his mind just went back to the time when they had meant so much to him. when he needed to have operations, when he'd come back from World War II and spent almost 4 years in the hospital. And they had a little cigar box that they put at Dawson's drugstore where he had been a soda jerk when he was growing up. And anyone who could spare some money put some funds in that little cigar box to help Bob with his recovery. And the people of Russell have always meant so much to Bob Dole. Let me say that again. The people of Russell have always meant so much to Bob. This is where his heart is, back home in his hometown. And I think looking out at that crowd, he just became emotional, thinking of all they had meant to him, especially during that time of his recovery from the World War II wounds. Also, his dad would have been 76 years old on August 19th.
An appropriate moment to thank Bob and Elizabeth Dole for spending the time that they did with me. That interview was done at their home at the Watergate in Washington. Then comes a great piece of political Americana, The Lost Key. Dole's sister, who was at the convention, told the Dole Oral History Project here at the Dole Institute, quote, "All Mom could think of was we'd better get home from the convention and get the house cleaned. It almost didn't matter. On the way out of town, Ford stopped his limo to drop off Dole's 73-year-old mother, and she was about to welcome the President of the United States in her home for a moment, but the key was missing. Everyone, including the President, apparently was looking all over the place for it, and Elizabeth found it behind a drain pipe, which I have to tell you, that would have been the first place I would have looked, but that's beside the point. Herbert Bloch was not a Richard Nixon fan, a Spiro Agnew fan, nor a Bob Dole fan. The cartoon, if you can't read it, is captioned, "I was hoping we weren't going to use that well this time," as they drag out of the sewer the Dole vice presidential campaign. The tough guy in '76. It's important to remember, Bill hit the nail on the head with the most important fact about the 1976 election. Ford ran the entire campaign from behind. Although he closed the gap towards the end, he never once led in the polls. He was down at least 30 points and got no convention bounce. All the strategy that we're going to talk about from here to the end has to be seen from playing catch-up ball to Jimmy Carter. Ford's campaign began with a Rose Garden strategy. It was unveiled at a strategy meeting in Vail on August 26. Ford decided that he would stay in Washington, make hay with the bicentennial, this is the bicentennial year, make hay with the bicentennial events, go to those, and be presidential. That would highlight, they felt, Jimmy Carter's inexperience in federal affairs. Dole's job was to hit the road, particularly the farm states, play into the traditional Republican base. Dole expanded on this in an interview. He said, noting that he had been on the House and Senate agricultural committees, "I understood cotton programs and I understood rice programs, not just Kansas crops. The South was the key if we were going to win. I could go talk farmer." In all the literature, nobody talks about Dole as a stratagem for winning the South against Jimmy Carter. But Dole wasn't 100% happy with this. He quipped that while Ford got the Rose Garden, he got a briar patch. This is Dole commenting on the decision, such as it was, to send him out on the road and hit hard.
Oh, yeah, I was going to be the tough guy, and he was going to be the soft-spoken guy, which he was. He's a wonderful guy. And he would be in the Rose Garden. And I'd be somewhere in someone a hard time.
Somewhere giving someone a hard time. Dole would visit 44 states and travel 60,000 miles in 10.5 weeks. The demands were horrendous. He was simply to cover every media market. He was to firm up the Farm Belt. He was to handle everything west of the Mississippi, to bring together the Reagan people and the Ford people, and probably in his spare time part the Red Sea. He was the bridge, and there was no question how he was going to be used. One of the first calls to Dole after his nomination came from a good friend, George McGovern, who reportedly offered, in the words of a Dole biographer, quote, a few ways that Bob might get under Jimmy Carter's skin. With a smile, Dole said to me, I think I remember checking back to see what some of the other bad guys had done as he planned himself. Now, this was a chancy move. Carter was preaching a new type of politics in 1976. The politics of expansion, the politics of caring, the politics of love, the politics of honesty. Sending Dole out in this manner could easily backfire. The person who recognized this first was Richard Nixon. He penned a note to Dole after the convention, and this note is online for you to take a look at the Dole Archives website. This letter was less to congratulate Dole than to offer him advice. Nixon was always full of advice. And I quote Richard Nixon now, this letter that's in front of you. In 1952 and 1956, I found the best way to help was always to campaign for the president and never myself. And now, by the way, you can think of this year if you want to. Campaign for the president and never myself. Also remember that you should always attack up and never horizontally. Take on Carter on the issues and mention Mondale only when you can tie his far-left record to the man who picked him. Above all, keep healthy and look and be at your best when you are on the tube. Dole took some of that advice. He certainly began on the attack. In Seattle at the American Legion Convention, he railed against Carter's proposed defense cuts, as well as the Democratic plan to pardon Vietnam-era draft evaders. But he was stopped dead in his tracks in mid-September when the Democrats started making hay with charges that a lobbyist for the Gulf Oil Corporation had made an illegal corporate contribution to Dole's 1973-74 re-election campaign. ABC ran a news story saying that Reagan wanted him off the ticket. It was soon found out to be a Democratic plant, but the damage had been done, and Dole dug in. He spent several weeks. He hired someone to dig up information in his own files to rebut this rather than just simply letting it go away. And it looked like it was going to stop the Dole campaign dead in its tracks. Ron Nesson, in his memoir, remembered that Larry Speaks, who was then acting as Dole's press secretary, moaned on a phone call, quote, the only way I can shut him up is to tape his mouth shut. It was time for a shift. Her rainbow to his ramrod, their Secret Service names. They'd been married a little over 8 months. The understatement of the afternoon is Elizabeth Dole saying to me, quote, the honeymoon was over. The Russell Daily News ran a story. The headline was, Mary Dole, Mary Elizabeth Hanford Dole, Mary Dole, perfect political wife. She's a handsome woman, the story said, of intelligence from the aristocratic Southern family. Boy, did they get it wrong. The key question, as we said, from the start, was whether a member of the federal government, the first spouse of a presidential or vice presidential candidate to be a federal office holder, could keep her job. Was this a conflict of interest or not? It had never been explored. On the decision to stay on the FTC.
Well, here's what happened. First of all, in terms of that question being put to me, I didn't know the answer, Bob didn't know the answer, the White House didn't know the answer. Everyone was calling Washington from Kansas City, trying to find out, what do we do? Does she have to resign? Because the press is all over this. And so my feeling was, if I did not have to resign, I would prefer to remain on the Federal Trade Commission, take a leave of absence, which the White House ultimately said, this is the way you can do it. You don't have to resign. Nothing in the law or regulations would require you to resign. But the leave of absence enabled me then to go back to the commission. And I felt, okay, Bob Dole and certainly Gerald Ford, this ticket is going to win. We've got a great ticket. And I want to go back to the commission and remain a commissioner once they win. So that was something I had to think through, but that was my decision after pondering it for a day or two.
And one of the reasons that she could stay on, I found here in the letters at the archives, was that the lawyers found out that she was not a civil service employee. Hers was rather a presidential employment, which freed her to campaign, and campaign she did. She was not coming into the campaign unprepared by any stretch of the imagination. She would make it clear later that the FTC had prepared her for a role in the upcoming campaign because her work had concentrated on policy. In Unlimited Partners, she said, I'm quoting her now, I wasn't going to spend the whole campaign answering reporters with a demure, I don't do issues. I did do issues, 6 days a week, unquote. What evolved was the decision for her to go out on her own, a completely separate campaign. She remembered for me that she started the campaign by going with her husband and listening to his speeches, and I began to pick up what he was saying very quickly. Together, they thought that they could expand their efforts if she went out on a separate campaign. Elizabeth Dole remembered that Lynn Navziger originally demurred, saying, and I quote, the spouse of a VP candidate will never get any ink, unquote. But it was Bob Dole who said, let's try. At first she went to the same cities as her husband, but then they split up, starting in Louisiana. She didn't know how many separate trips she had made. I do. In the Dole Senate papers, her itineraries or guesswork that Sarah found for me and that Audrey brought up, I went through and in an afternoon went through her itineraries one by one, found out where she went, and found out that she did an amazing 81 solo stops. Wow. But take a look at where they were. You don't need to be a genius in political science to know where they wanted to use her. Her husband was in the Midwest. They had given up the West, except for California. She did the East Coast and in the South. It was a remarkable, remarkable campaign. But there was another first. It's easy to forget that this debate was the first vice presidential debate in our history, unless you count all the times when John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were yelling at each other. Elizabeth Dole remembered in Unlimited Partners that Gerald Ford had suggested the debate within 24 hours of her husband's nomination. Ron Nessen remembered that the campaign staff tried to talk Dole out of it because they didn't think he was a good debater. When the debate was brought up in an interview that I had with Dole, he didn't even blank, and I just looked at me and said, I wish they hadn't had it, unquote. And I asked him why not, and he said, and I'm quoting him, I don't mind debating, but one thing I'll confess is that my problem was staying on message. The debate was held on October 15, 1976 at the Alley Theater in Houston, Texas, and it took on an added interest because prior to this debate, 1.5 weeks before, Gerald Ford had committed the gaffe of the election. Remember? Gerald Ford did not remember the map of Eastern Europe. And he forgot, in a mistake, and he said that Soviet troops were not in Poland. That wasn't the real mistake, though. he was given an opportunity to clarify in a follow-up question, and he dug in and said the same thing twice. So they had just gotten out of that debate, and the press was on gaff watch. Back in the debate books, it was Senator Ted Stevens who put together the most comprehensive debate book for Bob Dole that are here in the papers. There's copies upon copies upon copies upon copies of this until the last one, where you see that what Stevens has stuck in there is word for word the Yalta and the Potsdam agreements, so that Bob Dole won't make the mistake of saying that there are no Soviet troops in Poland. That was okay. Bob Dole would make his own error. He remembered that the early stages of the debate seemed to drag. And Mondale looked nervous, and I should have smiled more, quoting him, and that's absolutely true. But then came the famous Democratic Wars comment. Let's listen to it briefly, and then there's a little bit of a backstory to this.
Senator Dole, 2 years ago, when you were running for the Senate, you said that the pardon was prematurely granted and that it was a mistake. You approve of it now, and if the issue was fair game in your 1974 campaign in Kansas, why is it not an appropriate topic now?
It is an appropriate topic, I guess, but it's not a very good issue any more than the war in Vietnam would be, or World War II, or World War I, or the war in Korea. All Democrat wars, all in this century. I figured up the other day.
That's the key, by the way, that he strayed from the question. The question was about the pardon. But there's an important backstory to this. At an undated staff meeting during the Nixon administration, Nixon is on the famous Watergate tapes saying, and I'm quoting him here, "When Eisenhower left office, there were no American ground forces or advisors in Vietnam, and no Americans had been killed in Vietnam. 8 years later, when I came in, there had been 200,000 American casualties for over 40,000 American dead. The Democratic administrations of the 60s got us into this war, and the Nixon administration is getting out." And then came the kicker. "I want Dole to take this on and for others to follow up." So Dole had had this on his mind and had been asked to use this very line, which I found in the clippings here. He did as RNC chair on several occasions. And as we just heard earlier, he did in his welcoming speech. This wasn't just out of thin air. This was something that had been out there and a point that the Republicans felt that they could use. This has been treated like a gaffe. It wasn't. It was bad strategy. Later, responding, Dole was called by many colleagues praising him for the debate. Ford also called to tell him what a good job he did, and Dole said, "I wonder what he was watching." If 9,244 votes had changed, Hawaii and Ohio go for Ford and he wins. Dole was extremely ill at the end, to the point where they almost didn't join the president at the White House for the traditional vote counting. But Senator Dole shared a tidbit with me that I didn't know, and I think that this was the first that anyone had heard about this, that they were talking about a recount.
Was there any talk in that room about a recount?
Not that night. But, and of course, Bob was really feeling terrible. He had a very bad cold at that point. And so the next day, we talked about the situation, and Bob suggested that I talk with Bryce Harlow, who was a senior advisor to President Ford, to see how the president would feel about a recount. And the answer came back no. Ford did not want to have a recount.
But they were thinking about it. Did Bob Dole cost Gerald Ford the election? Bob Novak, David Broder, and in a very famous interview, Barbara Walters all claimed that he did. no less a luminary than in his memoirs, Jimmy Carter, commented on the anti-Dole chorus, calling Ford's choice of Dole, quote, a fatal political mistake. Not only because Dole was, in Carter's words, a flop on the campaign trail, but according to Carter, and this interested me because I think there's a possibility here, I'll be interested to know what Bill thinks about this, he felt that if Rockefeller had been on the Republican ticket, Ford would have won New York, thus winning the election. Do you agree with that off the top of your head? It's really hard to say. But the interesting and more interesting group that held Bob Dole accountable for the election was the family of Gerald Ford. In his memoirs, Ford mentions the Dole-Mondale debate in one short, terse paragraph. Betty Ford, however, was not so kind. The choice of Senator Dole, who was perceived as a hatchet man, along with other events, contributed to Jerry's defeat. In an oral history here at the Institute, Dole told an interviewer that he had run into Steve Ford at an event and the young man would not shake his hand. Scholarship, however, proves all of them wrong. Brand new book done by University Press of Kansas, the Gold series on the presidency, the vice presidency, Joel Goldstein, his book. He argues, first of all, that Mondale actually made a difference. Mondale added points to the Carter campaign. First time that a vice president since Lyndon Johnson had actually helped the campaign. He believed that 11% of the voters listed the vice presidency as a factor in their vote. 80% supported Carter Mondale. Bob Teeter, on the right, who was Ford's chief pollster and a very close personal advisor and friend, however, thought that Dole made a real difference. In January of 1977, in a letter here in the archives, Teeter sent Dole a post-mortem with some polling numbers. He said, "I thought your candidacy, Bob, helped the ticket in 3 significant ways. First, he found that Dole had helped the Republican defection problem, Republicans who were going to sit out the campaign because of Ronald Reagan. He said that rate was at 15% in October and dropped to 8% after the vice presidential debate, and that may have made a difference in New York. Second, he found that you were a great help carrying farm states, and he was specific. I'm quoting him, without you on the ticket, we could have had serious trouble in Kansas and Nebraska. And third, and this is absolutely key, there is absolutely no question, I'm quoting him here, there's absolutely no question but that the ticket did better in the areas where you campaigned than where you didn't." That gets us into thoughts about how the 1976 campaign affected their future. I asked them both when they were bitten by the bug. I couldn't resist. And they both responded in exactly the same way to me. That after 1976, there was no thought of moving on. There was no thought of entering the presidential primaries in 1980. In Bob Dole's words, "I am going to go and be the best senator that I can be." He wasn't thinking about the upper left announcing for the presidency. She wasn't thinking about the bottom right being sworn in by Vice President Cheney as senator from North Carolina. But the bottom line is that in 1976, both Elizabeth and Bob Dole had learned retail politics on the national level well. They had been tested. They had been tested on national television with Bob Dole and in the national print press with Elizabeth Dole. She remembered for me that campaigning on my own and learning how to handle the press was a key. This retail, and the retail politics, if Teeter is to be believed, if Bob Teeter is to be believed in his assessment, made a difference in this ticket and helped with getting the ticket closer. Their careers were now on an express ride. after 1976. We know where it ended. It began here. Thank you. Now, oh, thank you. That's more kindness than I'm used to. Now, for questions and answers, we can work under the assumption that I know everything, which is absurd, but if any of my students are watching this on the live stream, I know everything. But in this room are people who know a great deal more than me. We have a microphone. We have to use the microphone so that your questions can get onto the tape and onto the audio. So if you would raise your hand, if you would like to comment, I would ask you not to make a Trump or a Clinton-like speech. I don't think any of us can handle that today, besides you've had enough of me. But please, your questions. Yes, sir.
Why did Reagan choose Schweiker? And how exactly did Ford get Nelson Rockefeller out of the way?
There are simple answers to both those questions. Reagan was told by his chief advisors that if he didn't do something fast, Ford was going to utilize the incumbency to make deals with moderate delegates to make them vote for him at Kemper Arena. He had to do something with those undecideds to peel them away, and he was... Why Schweiker is very difficult to tell because Reagan wouldn't talk about this. Reagan didn't mention this in past years. This was a critical blunder that he didn't like to revisit. But it was clearly going to be a moderate senator. They also reached out to Jacob Javits of New York, another moderate Republican. It was going to be a moderate. It blew up in his face. Ford had the flip problem. He had to keep the conservatives at home. And in what was what was called, I think, a Sunday night massacre or Sunday afternoon massacre, Ford fired his Secretary of Defense, James Schlesinger, replaced him with Donald Rumsfeld, and called in Nelson Rockefeller and said, "I'm not going to nominate you." What came out of that, though, was just simply a historical spin of mega proportions, because Rockefeller fell on his sword and said that he quit because he wanted to help the ticket. It was not that way at all. He was asked not to run. It can be argued that both decisions were not good decisions. Anybody else? I was not that good. There is no way around it.
You hear a lot about Dole's wit, and that had he been more witty,
Yes.
it would have helped him. Would you comment on that?
Absolutely. In a time when people read newspapers as much as they watched television news, although it was shifting, the Dole wit did not translate to print as well as it did to television. Wait until 1980, wait until 1988, and the country will get a taste of it. But you have to imagine Bob Dole in print, so it doesn't work out quite as well. He tried to be funny in the debate, you know, with some lines in there, but there was no audience to play off it, so a lot of it was missed. His time with the wit will come, but it really wasn't 1976. I mean, the best line that he got off in the entire campaign was when he accepted the nomination and he said it was a good thing that I was in the hotel room to take the call. So, yes, sir.
Hello. Yeah, thank you for your presentation. It was terrific.
You're welcome.
I had a couple questions, if that's okay.
By all means.
All right, thank you. First, I was wondering if you had any ideas about how the Ford-Dole ticket carried California, because that usually, I don't know what the trend with that has been.
It's actually pretty simple. They carried Southern California with absolutely no problem. I don't think people realize how conservative a state California is once you get south of Los Angeles. They carried everything there and did remarkably well in L.A. Gerald Ford always did very well, although not Clinton well, but very well with the Hollywood crowd. Betty was just marvelous with them. They had cultivated them through the White House years, Pearl Bailey and others coming into the Ford White House. So it was close, but they won California, and when you carry Orange County as far as he did, it was pretty easy, actually.
Okay. Thanks. And also, Vietnam as a subtext and symbolically, because at the Democratic Convention you had Ron Kovic put in the name of a person who was a draft evader symbolically as vice presidential nominee, and you mentioned that Senator Dole mentioned the Vietnam War. How much of a role did that play at the Republican Convention, the Vietnam War?
At the Republican Convention, very little. In fact, Vietnam was effectively ignored at the Republican Convention. It was not an issue that they wanted to make a big deal out of. But when you got out onto the campaign, the buttons show up, pardon me, I'm voting for Carter. The Democrats recognized that they would have difficulty if they literally blamed the Republican Party and Nixon for Vietnam. So what they did, and what Carter did, and he writes a lot about this in his memoirs, it was kind of an interesting strategy. He tied Vietnam to the pardon of Richard Nixon. And, we want to get out of this long national nightmare. In fact, Carter went around the country using long national nightmare, which was, of course, Ford's line in pardoning Richard Nixon and beating him over the head with it, and tying Vietnam to the pardon. So Carter was in the enviable position of reminding everybody about Vietnam without ever having to say it. And it wasn't until the very end of the campaign when it was close, and in the third debate, when I think it was Max Frankel of the New York Times who asked President Carter whether or not he would commit troops to a Vietnam-like, I'm paraphrasing, I know I've got this wrong, but it's close, a Vietnam-like situation. Carter just essentially said, why don't you ask him? And Ford danced around. That was the closest that it came to it. You can say that Vietnam was a part of it if you see it through the lens of the pardon. Yes?
So Dole openly said himself that he would like to convict Nixon.
Yes.
But so why did he just basically waltz into the White House and start supporting him?
I could say that's politics, but I think that good question deserves a better answer. Bob Dole's loyalties to Richard Nixon ran very deep. He believed, and there is evidence for this, that Richard Nixon was largely responsible for the beginning of his career. And going into the stratosphere by taking him, a lot of people didn't want him to be the Republican national chair. Nixon stuck with him. He saw in Bob Dole something that he could use during Watergate. Dole felt that he owed Richard Nixon. Dole spoke at Richard Nixon's funeral glowingly and broke down and cried. And if you look at what happened, along the way, you wouldn't think that he would do that. To Bob Dole and other politicians like him, loyalty means everything. It certainly did with the book that I'm working on now with George Bush. You don't see that as much anymore, which is maybe where that question came from. You don't see that kind of loyalty anymore. Loyalty sometimes doesn't make logical sense. But Bob Dole had it for Richard Nixon. That's a really good question. Yes?
I want to ask about the woman vote. Now, 1976, and we do know since 1980 that women have voted the most in federal elections. So women can put you in and women can take you out. What was going on in 1976?
There was an attempt made on the part of the Republicans to exploit Betty Ford's support of ERA to get women's vote out. Carter said point blank that he would support the Equal Rights Amendment, so did Mondale, to try to get women's vote out. Essentially what happened, that women voted in the same numbers in 1976 that they did in 1972. It's still there. So what's going to force women out? It's 1980 when they all come out in droves to vote against Ronald Reagan. That's 4 years down the road. And then the story that you have women can take you out, that begins to happen after the 1980 convention, or the 1980 race. How does Mondale deal with it in 1984? Jerry Ferraro. To bring Jerry Ferraro onto the ticket. Which actually, I'll just answer that question with a question. What would have happened if Ford had chosen Ann Armstrong? Well, if you believe the oral histories of Nelson Rockefeller, he didn't do it because he felt that he was in a bind. He didn't want Ronald Reagan. No way. And if Reagan was put on the floor of that convention, anything could happen. So to keep the Mississippi delegation from putting Reagan's name on the floor of the convention, he went with Dole. But there's a lot of other reasons to go with Bob Dole that we talked about. Dole did win those states, very influential. Teeter's memo is critical here. Very influential in the Midwest. Dole was a good campaigner. I mean, we only hear the negative stuff. Dole was a very good campaigner who was well-liked. Elizabeth may very well have played a part in that in terms of the women's vote. You know, who's to know? Who's to know? But in terms of the choice of Bob Dole, why Kane? Why Mike Pence? Why anybody? You know, you get them in, and I've followed vice presidential choices a lot, and there's really not a lot of logic to it. You know, Ronald Reagan in 1980, picking someone who had said that his economic plan was voodoo economics, and he ends up with George Bush. How did that happen? Well, because a deal with Gerald Ford fell through, and he picked up the phone on a whim with Nancy literally yelling at him in the background, saying, "Don't do it," and he calls George Bush. You know, how do these things happen? And what would have happened if something had been different?
How would you compare or contrast how Bob Dole campaigned in '76 versus how he campaigned in '96 for the presidency? Is there a marked difference, or was he was much perceived as a hatchet man in '96 as well?
He was perceived as a hatchet man because continually through the press, and I will not pretend to be an expert on 1996, but the Clinton campaign was very good at reminding the public of 1976. I do remember one ad where the Clinton campaign ran a clip of Al Gore in the vice presidential debate with Jack Kemp. And you're just sitting there being a little bored, and Gore's being a little boring, and Kemp's being a little goofy, you know, the usual. And then it cut to a picture of Bob Dole in 1976 with the Democratic Wars comment. And there was no other copy. It's like, remember him back then? The Clinton campaign and its genius in terms of advertising image was able to bring that point up without making it look like they were hammering Bob Dole with it. Was Dole any different in 1996? Do leopards change their spots? Bob Dole had lost heartbreaking losses before 1996. He had been humiliated in South Carolina by George Bush's machine and the Lee Atwater machine in 1988. He had been, I don't know what expectations were in 1990 when he ran against Ronald Reagan. There were others who thought that he might be running for the vice presidency again, but he made some blunders there too. I think personally he was smoother and more graceful in 1996, but it didn't matter because he wasn't going to win, and the Republican National Committee took the money away from him at the last minute anyway. I wonder where that might happen again. Do we have any other? I have overstayed my welcome, so I'm going to call the ball. It was a pleasure to be with each of you. Bill, thank you so much. Audrey, thank you for having me. Thank you.